When we think of the American dream, we imagine freedom, bravery, and a new life. But for the British Empire, the New World was not a dream. It was a brutal battlefield for survival and profit. Today on 5-Point Historian, we are uncovering the 5 brutal truths of how Britain built North America. In this video, we will first explore the nightmare of Jamestown, where early settlers were forced to eat leather and horses just to stay alive. We will look at the legal theft of land, where English lawyers took more from Native Americans than any army ever could. We will uncover the dark history of the brown gold and how the tobacco industry created the tragedy of transatlantic slavery. We will relive the global war for Canada, a conflict so expensive that it almost destroyed the British treasury. And finally, we will see the royal betrayal, where the King of England turned his own loyal settlers into rebels. If you want to understand the dark roots of the modern world, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to 5-Point Historian right now. Your support allows us to keep digging into the truth of the past. Now let's go back to 1607. 1. The Nightmare of Jamestown. Survival at any cost. In 1607, 3 British ships arrived in Virginia to build the first permanent English settlement. Jamestown. The men on those ships weren't farmers. They were gentlemen and gold hunters. They expected to find mountains of gold, just like the Spanish had found in South America. But instead of gold, they found swamps, mosquitoes, and a winter that would become a living horror. The starving time, 1609 to 1610. By 1609, the colony was failing. They had no food, and the local Powhatan tribes were tired of the English stealing their corn. They surrounded the fort, trapping the settlers inside. This period is known in history as the starving time. Imagine being trapped in a wooden fort for months with nothing to eat. First, the settlers ate their horses, then they ate their dogs and cats. When those were gone, they ate rats and mice. Finally, they began to boil their own leather shoes and belts to get some nutrition. The darkest secret of survival. The first brutal truth is that Jamestown almost disappeared because of pride. For centuries, people whispered that some settlers turned to cannibalism to survive. Modern archaeology has now proven this was true. In 2012, researchers found the bones of a 14-year-old girl nicknamed Jane, whose remains showed she had been eaten after her death. Jamestown was not a glorious beginning. It was a desperate, bloody struggle. Out of the 500 people who were in Jamestown in 1609, only 60 survived until the spring. Britain didn't build America with ease. They built it on a foundation of starvation and extreme human suffering. They learned the hard way that the New World would not give up its secrets or its land without a fight. 2. The legal theft, lawyers versus land. We often see movies of soldiers fighting Native Americans in great battles. But the second brutal truth is that the English didn't just use swords to take the land. They used paper. The English brought a very specific idea with them: private property. To a British settler, if you don't have a fence and a legal document, you don't own the land. The cultural clash. The Native American tribes, like the Iroquois and the Wampanoag, had a completely different view. To them, the land was like the air or the ocean. It belonged to everyone and no one. When English leaders asked tribal chiefs to sign a contract, the chiefs often thought they were just giving the English permission to hunt or farm there for a season. They didn't realize they were selling their ancestral home forever. The weapon of the law. English lawyers were the most dangerous people in the colonies. They created complex laws that said if you didn't improve the land by building a permanent house or a farm, you had no right to it. Since many native tribes move with the seasons, the English declared their lands empty, terra nullius. Even when tribes tried to use the English court system to protect their homes, they almost always lost. The English would simply change the laws or use complicated language to confuse the tribal leaders. By the time the Native Americans realized what was happening, the fences were built, the trees were cut down, and the law was on the side of the empire. This legal theft was more effective than any bullet because it made the loss of land permanent and official. 3. The brown gold, tobacco, and the cost of profit. By 1612, the Virginia colony was still poor. They hadn't found gold, and they couldn't grow enough food to export. Everything changed when a man named John Rolfe, who later married Pocahontas, brought a new seed to Virginia, tobacco. This was the brown gold of the 17th century. In Europe, everyone was suddenly addicted to smoking, and they were willing to pay high prices for Virginia tobacco. The need for labor. Tobacco is a very difficult crop to grow. You need a lot of land and a lot of workers. At first, England sent indentured servants. These were poor white people from London or Bristol who signed a contract to work for 7 years in exchange for a trip to America and a small piece of land later. But the work was so hard and the climate was so deadly that many of them died before their 7 years were finished. The third brutal truth. The third brutal truth is that the American dream was built on the nightmare of slavery. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Virginia with 20 African captives. At first, they were treated like indentured servants. But as the tobacco industry grew, the laws changed. By the late 1600s, slavery was a permanent, hereditary status. The British realized that they could make more profit if they didn't have to pay workers or give them land after 7 years. This led to the creation of a massive triangle trade. British guns and cloth went to Africa, enslaved Africans went to the Americas, and tobacco and sugar went back to Britain. The wealth of the British Empire and the success of the American colonies were paid for by the lives and labor of millions of people who were treated as property. This wasn't just a side effect of history, it was the economic engine that made the colonies successful. If you think it's important to learn the real history, even the parts that are hard to talk about, please like this video and subscribe to 5-Point Historian. 4. The Global War for Canada. The 7 Years' War in the mid-1700s, Britain didn't own all of North America. The French owned a massive area called New France, which included most of modern-day Canada and the middle of the United States. The British and the French were like two giant monsters fighting for the same piece of meat. Between 1756 and 1763, they fought what many historians call the real World War I, the 7 Years' War. The battle for Quebec. The center of this fight was Canada. The British wanted to capture Quebec, the heart of French power. In 1759, a British general named James Wolfe led a daring attack, climbing the steep cliffs of Quebec at night to surprise the French army on the Plains of Abraham. The battle lasted only 15 minutes, but it changed history. Both the British and French generals died in the fight, but the British won. The fourth brutal truth. The fourth brutal truth is that this victory was a poison chalice. Britain won the war and took all of Canada, making them the most powerful empire in the world. But the war was so expensive that Britain's national debt doubled. They had spent millions of pounds to protect the American colonists from the French. To pay for this debt, the British government in London decided to do something they had never done before: tax the colonies. They passed laws like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act. The British thought, "We fought for you, so you should pay for the war. But the colonists, who had fought alongside the British, felt they shouldn't pay taxes to a parliament thousands of miles away where they had no voice. The victory over France removed the French threat, which meant the American colonists no longer felt they needed the British Army for protection. The war that gave Britain Canada was the same war that started the American Revolution. 5. The Royal Betrayal. The Line in the Dust. After winning the war against France, many American colonists were excited. They wanted to move west, past the Appalachian Mountains, into the rich lands of the Ohio Valley. They had fought and bled for this land, and they believed it was their reward. But in 1673, King George III did something that felt like a knife in the back. The Proclamation of 1763. The king issued a royal decree. He drew a line on the map and said, "No British colonist is allowed to move west of this line." He wanted to prevent more expensive wars with Native American tribes who were still living in those areas. The king wanted peace and lower costs, but the colonists saw this as a royal betrayal. The fifth brutal truth. The fifth brutal truth is that the American Revolution wasn't just about liberty or democracy. It was about land and money. The settlers felt that the king was protecting savages, as they called the Native Americans, instead of his own loyal subjects. They felt trapped on the coast, unable to grow their businesses or their farms. This created a frontier mentality. People who lived far away from the cities began to ignore the king's laws. They moved west anyway, creating their own small governments and fighting their own battles. They realized that their interests were no longer the same as the interests of London. The British Empire had built North America to be a source of wealth for the king, but they had accidentally created a new kind of person, the American. These were people who trusted their own guns and their own neighbors more than a crown in Europe. The betrayal of 1763 was the final spark. The British had built a giant, powerful engine in North America, but they no longer had the keys to drive it. The story of how Britain built North America is a story of incredible persistence, but it is also a story of extreme darkness. It began with a nightmare of cannibalism in Jamestown and ended with a revolution that changed the world. Between those years, the empire used legal tricks to take land, enslaved millions to grow tobacco, and fought a global war that left them broke. Britain didn't just build a country, they built a new world order based on property, profit, and global trade. We see the legacy of these 5 brutal truths in the borders of Canada, the laws of the United States, and the complicated history of race and land ownership in North America today. To understand the American dream, you must first understand the British struggle that created it. In our next video, maybe we are traveling to the other side of the planet to see how a single company, not a country, but a company, conquered the entire nation of India. You definitely don't want to miss that. Please like, subscribe, and stay historical. I'll see you in the next one.